The most important thing that you need to pay attention to are these anemia patterns that may be subclinical, meaning that your doctor hasn't identified that you have an overt anemia because the pattern doesn't match up with a clinical diagnosis. But if you have issues with the shape, size, or color, or the amount of hemoglobin in your body, and you have fatigue, if you're losing hair, if you have the symptoms of thyroid conditions, this is a deal breaker in your body's ability to recover. I'm Dr. Richard Robles. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about another one of the deal breakers to getting rid of your thyroid symptoms, and this has to do with anemia. Anemia is really stressful in the body for a couple of reasons. Number one, your brain requires constant fuel to make sure that it can function appropriately. One of those fuels is oxygen, and when we breathe the oxygen in, it attaches to our red blood cells and it's carried to every part of our body. When this happens normally, it helps to make sure that we have proper oxygen saturation to every system, in particular the brain. And of course, remember that the brain is where your thyroid signals begin. Your hypothalamus sends signals to your pituitary to tell your thyroid to excrete hormone. Now, what does anemia do? How do you identify it? And when is it problematic for you? Now, just as we discussed with some of the other markers, we have to look at our lab ranges a little bit differently. Sometimes we have lab ranges that will specifically identify pathology, and there's a little bit of a gray area where when we're close to the end range but we're not quite outside of it, then we can start to figure out like, hey, there's a problem here. It's not an overt pathology, but it's disrupting the body's function and it's creating symptoms. And we're going to go through that with anemia here. Now, when it comes to anemia, we're looking at a part of your blood work called the complete blood count. In particular, the section related to red blood cells. So what I want you to do is get your lab work from your endocrinologist, your family practice physician, your chiropractor, your naturopath, whoever it is that ordered it. Get that lab work, and you should look at it while you watch this video with me. So there's three things that are measured directly for your complete blood count that are related to your red blood cells. First is they count your red blood cells. Second is they measure your hemoglobin. And then third is that when they take your blood, they put it into a test tube and then they centrifuge it, which spins it around really quickly. Because your blood is heavier, it tends to pack towards the bottom. And so how much of that test tube is red after they centrifuge it is what the percentage is. That's known as your hematocrit. So those are the three measurements that are taken typically directly from you're actually measured directly in your blood. Then there are other calculations that determine the size and the color of your red blood cells. And those are important for identifying problems with vitamin deficiencies and other types of issues in the body. So we need to take we're going to take a look at the first three markers, your red blood cell count, your hemoglobin, and your hematocrit first. And we're going to look at these separately for men and for women. So for women, we have a different range for what we're looking for. Your red blood cell count should be no lower than 3.9. If it's lower than 3.9 or higher than 4.5 or 4.5, then we have two problems that are distinct that we're going to discuss. If your hemoglobin is less than 3.5 or more than 14.5, then we're going to identify two other problems. And if your hematocrit is less than 37% or greater than 44%, then we have two problems. Okay, so we're going to identify those lab markers first, and then we'll go over what they mean in just a moment. For men, the red blood cell count should be between 4.4 and 4.9. If it's lower than 4.4 or higher than 4.9, we're going to use these same two categories to define it, so higher or lower. Your hemoglobin, if it's less than 14 or if it's greater than 15, then we're going to identify two problems. And then if your hematocrit is less than 39% or greater than 50%, then we have two other problems. Okay? So if you're on the low side of either your red blood cell count, your hemoglobin, or your hematocrit, meaning that it's less than those markers the low side of those markers that we talked about, then we need to be worried about the amount of iron in the blood or in the body. Second is if those markers are higher than that, but they're still within the lab range, mind you, for both of these. In particular, the red blood cell count, when it's elevated outside of the ranges that I just gave you, but it's lower than the lab range, then we would be concerned with either hypoxia, which could be from moving into like a higher altitude, or decreased hydration, meaning you're not drinking enough water. So if your red blood cell count is slightly elevated, if your hematocrit is slightly elevated, or your hemoglobin is slightly elevated, then we suspect that there's improper hydration in the body and you need to drink more water. Now, the other three markers that we're going to look at are your MCV, your MCH, and your MCHC. These measure the size and the color of your red blood cells. The first one, the MCV, is going to measure the size of your red blood cells. So for men and women, if it's less than 85, then there tends to be a problem with B6, the amount of B6 in the body, meaning that there's likely too little B6 in your dietary intake. And if it's greater than 92, then we're going to suspect that there's some type of an issue with B12, either what you're getting from your diet or the ability to absorb and use it in your body. Next, your MCH, this and your MCHC have to do more so with the color of your red blood cells. If your MCH is less than 28, then we would be concerned again with B6 issues, and if it's greater than 32, we'd be concerned with B12 issues. Same thing with MCHC. If it's less than 32, we're concerned with B6. If it's more than 35, then we're considering B12 issues. Now, here are some of the risk factors that you need to take into consideration. If your B12 is on the low side and you start to see that the color of your cells is too bright, meaning that the MCH or the MCHC is slightly elevated, or your size is big, your MCV is on the large size or greater than that range that I just gave you, then we're worried about B12. Now, vegetarian, vegan diets, or junk food vegetarian or junk food vegan diets will be low in B12. If you eat a ton of produce, green leafies and so on, you can keep your B12 adequate. But if you don't, then you're going to see that B12 is low. It also tends to be that with the standard American diet, if you are eating a lot of junk food, you're not going to get the adequate amounts of B12 that you need. Where do you find B12? B12 is going to be in animal meat, but in particular in the liver. Just like your body, most of the B12 is stored in your liver. Your body can store about maybe 3 to 4 years of B12 in your liver. But when it starts to get low, where do you look to get those resources? From the same place it's stored in animals that it's stored in people. That's the liver. So liver is a great way to really increase your B12 amount. Make sure it's organic, grass-fed if you're using beef liver, that at minimum it's organic if it's chicken. But make sure you increase that liver intake. Otherwise, there's always supplements. One of the companies I prefer is Premier Research Labs, but make sure that the B12 that you get, you sometimes need to make sure that it's methylated, and you need to watch the type of B12 it is, depending on certain things that we'd find in genetic testing, because certain people do not use non-methylated B12 well, and it can cause problems in their body if you start to increase like cyanocobalamin or other types of B12s that aren't pre-methylated. So that's an important thing to pay attention to if you haven't had nutrigenomic evaluation. That's something that we do in the office to help patients start to understand how their body uses B12 and why there may be issues. Other things you can find with B12 is that sometimes it's not absorbed well due to lack of intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is in the stomach, and it helps attach to B12 and pull it through the intestinal wall so that you can absorb it and use that B12. Some people make what are called autoantibodies to intrinsic factor, which means that your immune system will eliminate the availability of that intrinsic factor. This is an autoimmune condition, and if you have a thyroid problem, then you're probably aware that the majority of thyroid conditions are autoimmune in nature, about somewhere between 80 to 90%. When you have autoimmunity in one part of the body, it's very common to see that it's impacting other parts. The intrinsic factor is one of the areas that we'll see it impact. Another is parietal cells in your stomach, and the intrinsic factor can be an issue because it'll change the way that your body absorbs and uses B12. So those are some of the issues with B12: dietary sources, poor nutritional habits, poor diet, poor eating habits, and then the availability of getting it into the body. B6, that tends to be more of a dietary issue. If you're not eating, again, these organ meats like your liver are going to have, good amounts of B6 in them, but your green leafies are also going to be a good source. So making sure that you get ample amounts of B6 and B12 in your diet is important. If not, then look into supplementing. Talk to your natural health care provider, or contact my office for information on supplements that may be useful for you. You can also go to my online store at holisticneeds.com if you're a patient of mine. or you can become a patient, a distance patient, and we can offer you certain supplements through that site as well. The other thing to pay attention to is for women, you menstruate, and so you're going to have a constant need to make sure that you're taking care of your body's health, especially women who have not stopped menstruating. You're going to have a need to make sure that you're taking care of your body's ability to regulate and use red blood cell production. So another factor to consider is, aside from just these markers related to how many red blood cells you have, how much hemoglobin they have, and what the size and shape and color of them are, the other thing to pay attention to is that poor kidney health can also decrease the ability to make red blood cells in the body. So your kidneys make a hormone called erythropoietin, and what this does is it tells the body to produce more immature red blood cells, or reticulocytes. And this is the step from these baby red blood cells turning into mature red blood cells, where iron deficiency or B6 issues or B12 issues will have an impact on the production of these reticulocytes, and also their maturation into red blood cells, which are supposed to carry your oxygen to your brain and the other parts of your body to maintain health. So not drinking your water can have a negative impact on your kidneys, but so can other things like high nitrates in foods, and there are other things that perhaps I'll get to in another video. So the most important thing that you need to pay attention to are these anemia patterns that may be subclinical, meaning that your doctor hasn't identified that you have an overt anemia because the pattern doesn't match up with a clinical diagnosis. But if you have issues with the shape, size, or color, or the amount of hemoglobin in your body, and you have fatigue, if you're losing hair, if you have the symptoms of thyroid conditions, this is a deal breaker in your body's ability to recover. So make sure you address these anemia pattern issues, and if you have any hesitation in dealing with them on your own, make sure you contact somebody who's familiar with dealing with them in these non-pathological ranges or these functional ranges to really help guide you into having the right things. Because dosing up on iron can be bad for your body too. Iron's a metal, and too much of that particular metal can be toxic to your system. So make sure you do this wisely, and you pay attention to the fact that if I'm not your doctor and I'm not helping you take care of this, that you talk to your doctor about what to do. All right? I'm Dr. Richard L. Robles, and I hope this information helps you get on your path to health. Thank you.